Welcome back, people from the Kingdom of England, Empire of Albion. You know who it is, Archbishop Belmont from the illustrious Noble House of Belmont. And I'm doing these segments to bring you back up to speed so that way you can start finding yourself coming back to the Third Temple English Church of England. Because there, I know many brothers and sisters feel intimidated, especially to be amongst the panel or to be amongst the King's bench when we're doing our lessons. But these little side lessons that I'm doing right here is to bring you back up to speed from what we already have been going over. Hopefully it's less intimidation, but we're going to still hold you 100% accountable even from these lessons that I'm bringing. So that way when you come into the church, you can't say that you didn't hear this information. All right. So let's go ahead and get started with this part 2 is use what you got to get what you want. And to get what you want is to come back home to the Kingdom of England. To use what you got is your birth certificate. And your birth certificate is a settlement certificate. All right, so let's go ahead and read it. Settlement certificates, examinations, and removal orders, parish and poor law. Now, remember the parish and poor law, this is going back to the Elizabethan settlement era, settlement time, and when a lot of, foreigners were coming into the kingdom and a lot of them were poor, and they needed something to do or some type of way to keep record of all of these paupers or vagabonds or these destitute, people. And so this is where they start removing them and settling them in different locations within the colonies. And as you can see, those settlement certificates transitioned into what we're going to show you is the modern day birth certificate. The parishes were underneath the jurisdiction, originally underneath the church. But then after the dissolution of the monasteries and after the Township Act of 1798 or 1790, one of those years, the so-called state took over. And you're going to go ahead and learn a lot of this, hopefully through what I'm going to read today. Nature of source. Records generated from the Act of Settlement and Removal, 1662, which established the need to prove entitlement to poor relief by issuing of settlement certificates. The certificates prove which parish a family belonged to. Like I was telling you, the counties we can call parishes today. And therefore, which parish had the legal responsibility to provide poor relief if needed. It's like welfare, Social Security, all of that stuff is poor relief. The certificate gave the right of a person to live and receive welfare in their parish of legal settlement. The settlement certificates, although issued by the overseer of the poor, once again, that's your administrators who work in those overseeing the operations for those benefits you're applying for, were not issued exclusively to paupers. It may be incorrect to assume that a person's parish of settlement was the same as their parish of birth. You hear this? Just because you were born just because you went to some place doesn't mean you were born there, or just because you're born somewhere don't actually mean you're from there. Especially for women, as on marriage, they acquire settlement rights in the husband's parish. In the event of the parish authorities discovered that a person was likely to become financial burden and become chargeable to the parish, such as illegitimacy cases, those taken ill suspected illegal immigrants or vagrants, the parish authorities undertook a settlement examination. The examination took place under the auspices of the overseer of the poor, and a justice of the peace was carried out to determine whether the person had a legitimate right to residency in the parish. The results of an examination are found in examination papers. Following the findings, a guilty person will be served a removal order and then forcibly, if necessary, removed from the parish. These procedures were part of what is known as the Old Poor Law. A person gained the right of settlement under the following conditions. A newborn child took the father's settlement regardless of the place of birth. Remember, that's underneath the status of the father under England, which is the de jure law. A parish apprentice from the age of 7 who served and lived in the same parish for 40 consecutive days. A married trader or person renting small holding or farm who had stayed for 12 months. Paid parish rates and rented property over 10 plus years. 10 pounds per year, my bad. An unmarried man who had worked for a year in the parish. A woman took the settlement of the man she married, and a widow who remarried took the husband's settlement. Servants who stayed 1 year from date of hiring and left with full wages. So just like today, people who are going to a city and they're getting a job or they're becoming a resident, just by applying anything within those territories, like they say, it will place you underneath the status of settling there, as you can see from what I'm reading. A person who inherited an estate of land and lived on the estate for more than 40 days could. So these are all of the requirements for a person to gain the right of settlement under these conditions. So either you were marrying in, you was an apprentice from the age of 7 who lived there for over 40 consecutive days, an unmarried man who worked a year in the parish, and then somebody who inherited the estate of land and lived there for more than 40 days. That was all required to be considered a settler. So even like, as you see, if you go to a city and you live there, I think what is it, longer than 30 to 45 days, something like that, consider a resident. So they NH you with taxes, or they tell you better have this stuff registered, blah, 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 but we'll talk about that later. The survival rate of these papers is patchy. Removal orders were often issued to single pregnant women. You hear this? So the examination of removal papers might state the putative father. The self-certificate provides little direct genealogical information, but does place a man and his wife in a particular location at a particular time. That's the birth certificate. This could be useful if their wife's name was not known. The certificate will probably indicate that the marriage took place in their parish of settlement, as well as the baptism of one or both partners. The quarter sessions dealt with disputed settlement cases. The vestry minutes to other parish officials' accounts also dealt with settlement issues. Occasionally, baptismal marriage certificates might be attached to the records. Vagrants were also forced to undergo settlement examinations where these records exist. Provide a thorough biography of the individual. In 1834, the new poor law was enacted, which removed the provision. And we don't need to worry about the 1834 because at this point, we're in the so-called American or British American colonies where those who look like me were in so-called bondage. All right. So the genealogical value, settlement certificate, name of the husband, wife, and their address. Examination papers, name, age, place of birth, parentage examinee, the examinee's apprenticeship, occupation, place, date of birth. As you can see, it shows, like I said, your former address, the names, your former husband and wife's relatives, employers. So it's pretty detailed. Not to the point that it shows you where you came from, like genealogy, but it gives enough information based off of who you are, what you're doing, and your family and all that. Removal orders, name and the name of the person's parish of settlement. All right. Okay, so now that you've seen and heard briefly regarding the settlement certificate, I'm going to read from this website. Because what it's going to do is going to give you a better understanding of the settlement certificate. And usually, like I said, I don't read stuff like this off of other websites. I try to find the original, but you got to take what you can get. And like I said, if it don't apply, don't let it fly. Or if it apply, let it fly. Whatever, however that saying is. Okay, so we already read and just talk about birth settlement certificates. You already know what it says. A settlement certificate, also known as a birth certificate, since 1837. Let me zoom in. Okay. Also known as birth certificate since 1837, it's an official document issued to validate recorded paupers, granting them certain basic rights and entitlement to benefits in exchange for recognition of their status as being owned as property and lawful slaves, also known as indentured servants and bondsmen. A settlement, therefore, is equivalent to a voluntary slave plantation. All right, you hear that? So being born here and with a birth certificate is pretty much is an equivalent to you being born in a slave plantation or in the companies, which we know because the companies are plantations. All right. Origin of settlement birth certificates. Under King Henry VIII of England and his Venetian Magyar advisors, the first poor laws were promulgated around 1535, coinciding with the first official mandate requiring uniform record keeping by all Church of England parishes of births, deaths, and marriages. The poor were considered the responsibility of the church, including ensuring they had ample work and did not starve to death, as they were considered by default the property of the church. Under Queen Elizabeth I of England, a set of measures which were introduced, which had the effect of accelerating the disenfranchisement of land peasants to landless paupers. Under the Erection of Cottages Act 1588, peasants required local parish permission to erect dwellings, whereas before the erection of dwelling by land peasant on their lord's land was considered a right. So you see, even today, like you see, they require you to go and get a so-called license or permit for you to even build on whatever you so-called say it is yours. And to go to show you that it's not yours. You know, you only have a so-called benefit over here because the settlement or birth certificate. All right. As a result, the ranks of the landless, poor, or pauper swelled. Under Queen Elizabeth I, England, the laws concerning the administration and care of the poor were refined through the Poor Law 1601, which introduced a basic set of rights for the poor, as well as the introduction of 2 overseers of the poor, guardian. Many of you heard of what a guardian is. In each parish elected at Easter and funded through the first levy tax through local rates, now called council taxes on property owning ratepayers. Under Charles II of England, the concept of settlements as plantations of working poor controlled by the Church of England was further refined through the Settlement Act 1662 and Poor Relief Act 1662, including for the first time the issuance of settlement certificates equivalent to a birth certificate, passport, and social security rolled into one document. A child's birthplace was its place of settlement, unless his mother had a settlement certificate from some other parish stating that the unborn child was included on their certificate. However, from the age of 7 upwards, the child could have been apprenticed and gained a settlement for itself through called indentured service or voluntary slavery. Also, the child could have attained a settlement for itself by service by the time it was 16. All right, so voluntary slavery is like when you're going to sign any of these contracts to do so-called work that you feel you need to take care of yourself. They're all voluntary contracts, but they're voluntary contract to make you a debt slave. Because what do you get paid out of those so-called contracts you so-called working for? Debt notes. And debt notes were for who? For slaves. Because the only way for you to so-called pay a debt will be with gold and silver. Debt notes aren't gold and silver. They're not even equivalent. They're backed by human chattel labor. Slavery. Let's continue. Also, the child could obtain, which I already said, settlement for itself by the age of 16. Under the Reforms of Settlement Act 1662 and the Poor Relief Act 1662, no one was allowed to move from town to town without their appropriate settlement certificate. That's your birth certificate. If a person entered the parish which he or she did not have official settlement and seemed likely to become chargeable to the new parish, then an examination would be made by the justices or parish overseers. From this examination on oath, the justices would determine if the person had the means to sustain himself. The results of the examination were documented in the examination paper. As a result of the examination, the intruder would either be allowed to stay or be removed by means what was known as the removal order, the origin of the modern equivalent of the eviction and the removal notice when the sheriff removes people from their home. All right, so if you weren't supposed to be there based off of the settlement certificate and you couldn't take care of yourself, they got rid of you. Because remember, you were becoming a nuisance to the parish. And remember, the parishes were underneath the jurisdiction of the Church of England. But remember, the Church of England this time was the Roman Catholic Church. It's not the English Church, it's the Roman Catholic Church. All right. According to the various Settlements Act from the 17th century onwards until the introduction of birth certificates, the issue of a settlement certificate was considered a privilege, not a right. You hear that? If a peasant wanted to move, the home parish could choose to issue a settlement certificate, which then effectively became indemnity insurance to the new parish if the pauper was unable to earn a living. A settlement certificate was only valid if it bore the seals of the overseers of both parishes and that of the local justices and was not transferable. You hear that? So your birth certificate, when you realize it, those aren't transferable. When you're so-called born in a so-called territory, you take that birth certificate everywhere you go. They don't update it with new information. You don't get a new looking birth certificate with new info. I mean, with the same info from a different territory. It's the same one that you were so-called born in. All right. A settlement certificate was only valid aboard the civil said. This is the same model of modern passports for citizens listed as P for paupers or peons used today. Due to the increase in number of poor in 1723, a new law was passed called the Workhouse Test Act, in which those who wish to claim benefits and relief as poor now had to enter a workhouse, being essentially a prison for men, women, and children to perform some set of work. You know, that's like out here is you see those who so-called get food stamps, they require you to do what? You got to get a job. You can't just be getting food stamps and then not working too. They make you actually work as well. So I'm showing you that the British American colonies are still underneath Great Britain. If you're not paying attention and seeing what's going on, it's still the same rulership, because it can only be one so-called sovereign state at a time, you know, and only a sovereign can create a sovereign. But we're going to talk about that later. This is both the origin of the P still placed as a mark on modern passports and other official documents, and the P worn by prisoners from the 20th century, beginning in the 1773 with the Enclosure Act 1773, followed by the Enclosure Consolidation Act of 1801. English Parliament effectively privatized massive amounts of common land for the benefit of a few, causing huge numbers of land peasants to become landless paupers, and therefore in need of parish assistance. The Enclosure Acts are the foundation of land title as it is known today. All right. Because of deliberate legal theft of land enclosure laws of the 18th and early 19th century, the number of paupers dramatically increased. So as you see, since they were taking our property or whatever that was specifically supposed to be ours, it started making us become broke or homeless, which means we started needing help. And we needed help, that we had to go to so-called parishes or the overseers of the parishes. All right. This led to the most awful and cruel laws being introduced to deliver to an elite few. The slave labor force needed for the Industrial Revolution through the Poor Law Amendment Act 1834, which effectively stated that the poor could not receive any benefit unless they were constantly employed in a workhouse prison. You hear that? So like today, like once again, they'll pull your so-called food stamps from you. They find out that you ain't so-called working or you're not trying to gain employment. All right. Or any other so-called, like I said, benefit you have, that they can take it from you, because it's a benefit, it's not a right. Thus, despite international treaties against slavery, the very worst slavery being wage slavery, that y'all dealing with today, or lawful slavery, was born, whereby men, women, and children lived in terrible conditions and were worked to death. That's what's going on today. Many brothers and sisters, many families, they don't even have the best living conditions. They have a lot of stuff going on at home, and yet they're being worked to death. You know, they're barely getting any sleep. They out here having to be pulled into this horrible, horrendous traffic, dealing with these automobiles, putting their life on the line each and every day just to be broke still. And clearly you're always going to be broke if you're out here working, because they can't give you money. They don't have any money. It's debt notes. Only gold and silver is true payment for debt. But that's why you have to get your consciousness and get this understanding, so that way you can come home and be properly saved and actually get what you need. All right. Beginning 1834, a number of historic changes were introduced to the record keeping of births, deaths, and marriages, the issuance of documents, and the management of the poor. 1834, British Parliament introduced the Poor Law Amendment, which reorganized the Church of English parishes into unions. You hear this? And this has nothing to do with us. So we're going to say the Roman Catholic Church of England parishes into unions, which will then be responsible for the poor in their area and administered by a board of poor law guardians, also known as Board of Guardians. The clerks of magistrate courts still hold the power of a clerk of the Board of Guardians. Yes, they do. Because remember, the magistrates are the ones who so-called grant those who want to get so-called custody to so-called wards. All right. In 1835, the Municipal Corporations Act 18, was introduced, which effectively standardized the corporate model for towns and boroughs, including making the municipality with elected officials responsible for data collection and service administration. So once again, today, all your so-called cities are municipalities. Every last town, borough, city, whatever you name it, are underneath a municipality, or which we call underneath the Municipal Corporations Act. And municipalities, we know, go back to Rome. Municipalities are foreign. According to the 1580 Acts of Religion, English heirs, we don't supposed to be dealing with that, you know, but only way for you to actually be able to utilize that, you got to come back into the church. Otherwise, you have to do this because you're still listed as property of Rome. All right. In 1836, in Births and Deaths Registration Act was introduced, which for the first time created the General Register Office and the requirements for uniform records of births, deaths, and marriages across the empire by municipal councils and unions of parishes. So as you see, all municipal councils or all municipal so-called cities that you stay in are all still keeping up the requirements or the uniform requirements for the General Register Office. Going back to Britain. So as we see, Great Britain is still here. They're not calling it that because you're being occupied. And plus, we don't know who everybody is. All of you not heirs, you know, a lot of you are denizens. Even if you look like me, a lot of you are denizens. So it says, thus on July 1st, 1837, the birth certificate was formed as a successor of the settlement certificate for all paupers, disenfranchised of their land birthright, to be considered lawful voluntary slaves with benefits provided by the local parish, which is your county, townships, whatever, underwritten by the Society of Lloyds, as is still today. And remember, and all of this is underneath your Social Security. So if you have a Social Security card and a birth certificate, you're still listed as a so-called pauper, and naturalized one at that. All right, beginning from 1871, further historic changes in the administrative vital statistics such as birth certificates and death certificates, with the introduction of health districts or sanitary districts. The Local Government Act of 1841, Public Health Act of 1872, and Public Health Act 1875 created a system of districts called sanitary districts, governed by a sanitary authority responsible for various public health matters, including mental health, legally known as sanity. You hear this? Sanitary and sanity. People are insane out here because it's not sanitary. You get your sanity when it's sanitary out here. It's not clean out here. It's very dirty. So you're going to be outsane or insane. These types of sanitary districts were created being urban and rural, while the sanitary districts were abolished in 1894 with the Local Government Act of 1894. The administration of the poor is still maintained in part under the concept of district health boards of guardians, including magistrates and other justices of the peace. So as you can see, the sanitary districts didn't disappear. Everything just evolved underneath the so-called modern or local government that you're dealing with today. All of those departments are all part of your so-called local government. And so as you see, they're still keeping up what they were created to do. They're not saying it blatantly, but they're showing you based off of historical records that they are still what they come from, what their predecessors were. Since 1990, under the United Nations and the World Health Organizations, WHO, by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the system of issuing birth certificates as proof of a man or a woman being a permanent member of the underclass has become an international system. Pay attention, because we know that many brothers and sisters, which we know all of us here are mixed up, but they're clearly telling you that birth certificates right here were to make you a permanent member of the underclass in the international system. Now, why is that? Why does the birth certificate make you a underclassman? It's because it makes you property. It makes you property. All right. Birth certificates is proof one is born on the land. One fundamental flaw that remains within the settlement birth certificate system for the Roman cult, and remember, yes, this did come from Rome, and its agents remains the fact that a settlement certificate is proof that a man or woman must have been born on the land for the certificate to have effect, regardless of convoluted subsequent presumptions of what the certificate actually represents. If a man or woman was not born on the land somewhere, a certificate could not be issued. Therefore, any rejection or return of a birth certificate serves as a perfected evidence that a man or woman was born on the land and support to any affidavit of truth concerning their immutable rights from the divine creator. Now, a lot of that, like I said, we ain't going to talk about and get into. This built-in flaw is offset through the treatment of men and women as land themselves, though the deliberate corruption of the definition to land to include all that has been born naturally or self-improved on the land In other words, the sharp edge reason the system ultimately denies each citizen their share of the commonwealth because they're considered chattel and mere creatures less than slaves. And that is absolutely right, because anyone who actually came out of the church who weren't actually truly members of the English church, and you came with William the Conqueror, you're considered property of William the Conqueror, and William the Conqueror was a Roman. Yes, William the Conqueror worked for Rome. All right. Birth certificates are not extremely valuable to the holder in whose name the certificate is issued. While it is true that birth certificates are considered valuable securities that are traded amongst the private international entities in the elite, the holder whose name the certificate is issued does not have access to such value. Instead, by holding the birth certificate, the man and woman essentially consent to being treated as a pauper or peon, and the sole obligation of the elite to provide mere scraps so that the man or woman does not die of starvation or great illness. Exactly, because remember, they took ownership of the true English church, and so therefore they took ownership of the so-called people. Remember, they're playing gods, but they're not. And so what they're doing, they're giving you a piece of what you're actually supposed to have. You're supposed to be having a whole when they're only giving you a small morsel, just enough to keep you alive. Just enough to keep you alive. That's all they're giving you. Yeah, it's evil. Let's continue. As settlement certificates and birth certificates are solely and purposely designed to disenfranchise men and women from their rightful inheritance through voluntary enslavement and admission to being paupers, the system of birth certificates is wholly without legitimacy, a global system of organized fraud and crime, and without lawful effect. Okay. So there you have it. You know, the birth certificate, which is the settlement certificate, it is really only was giving to you to tax you. It was given to you to tax you. And now, as you see, what you must actually do to be able to correct, you have to come back into the church, the true English church, because the English Church of England was the de jure church that predated the so-called Roman Catholic Church of England. And as you see, Henry VIII was a Roman Catholic. And then they were only just sitting on in our positions as puppets to try to change our laws and way how we did everything via agnatic succession from the patrilineal line. So we have to fix that. And as you see, only way for us to fix it, you got to use what you got to get what you want. And that's the birth certificate. And the birth certificate can prove your identity going back to time immemorial, because your surname can be traced back to specific people. All right. And those folks are your family. You are who you come from without doubt or contradiction. So that being said, thank you. I love you. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm going to do a lot more videos, and we need your donations. If you don't donate, we can't help you. And once this church gets taken off, once the church starts taking off the way it is, because there's a lot that's taking place in the private that many of you have no idea. We have literally been working in the private for the last almost 3 years, getting things ready to go. And it's looking very, very fruitful and promising. So if you want to come home, do your work. Like I said, if you don't donate, you don't help us, to do what we need, because we need those donations to keep the church running, to keep us to be able to put in these lawsuits, to be able to help take care of the heirs, to be able to do any of our earthly obligations and needs finances. And until we can correct this issue, with the courts with them are making us have to use this false fraudulent fiat that we know we shouldn't be utilizing. But guess what? It was created because they're supposed to be able to use it during a time of war, which, as you can see, you're still dealing with the time of war because you're still mentally have been occupied and you never came back into the proper true church. So with that being said, I love you. Please, once again, make sure you're taking care of yourself, take care of your loved ones, especially your children. Fathers, those who cannot be in their children's life, do whatever you can, reach out, because the only way for a lot of this to be fixed is we have to accept sorry about that. But like I said, fathers, do your job. Get your houses in order. Mothers, sisters, daughters, please start listening, because a lot of this information is actually is referencing the fall, and the fall of woman and with the fall of her innocence. And right now, the time that we're dealing with is the time of judgment. This is judgment days. You know, Brother Kevin Samuel just passed away. I take all of these things as signs. Samuel's means name of God. And the way Kevin Samuels, the way he spoke, you know, many people may not think he was doing the work of, you know, our ancestors, but he was. And I saw it on a whole nother perspective that was going to be actually able to help us getting our heirs to come back home, because it's the family. And you got to put the family first, or the blood first, or the group first, or the church first, because without this, you don't exist. All right. So with that being said, I love you. I'm going to go and have a lot more videos coming. But once again, I can't do this if you're not helping. If you're not helping me, I can't help you. And there's not many people who can actually bring it to you the right way, unless they're actually coming out of the Third Temple English Church of England, which has been headed properly by our king who has returned, King Clifford Jefferson from the Royal House of Plantagenet. And Plantagenet, yes, is English as well as French. And once again, we are those people. It's in the blood. So, and England is the hierarchy, or which we can call Great Britain or Albion. But no matter how you slice and dice it, it has to come through the blood, and the true blood heirs du jour have returned. So with that being said, peace. See you soon.